The objective seems simple. Throw a round ball into a round basket, tacked to a balcony 10 feet above the floor. When James Naismith introduced this new game to his class of 18 young men in an otherwise unremarkable gymnasium in Springfield, Massachusetts, little did he know what he had created. The traditional story has always been straightforward enough. Basketball is American, invented by a Canadian. It's taught that way in the history books, repeated in documentaries, enshrined in the Basketball Hall of Fame. This American-centric framing treats basketball as emerging fully formed from one man's ingenuity in 1891, when really it was the product of diverse cultures and influences across multiple Western contexts. And at the heart of it all was a man whose family repeatedly insisted he was a Canadian Scot, not simply Canadian, and that his Scottishness was essential to understanding both him and the game he created. I'm delighted to be joined on this first episode of this series on the history of basketball in Scotland by Dr. Ross Walker, lecturer in sports management at the University of Stirling. Over the past few years, Ross has written a number of published papers about the history of the sport of basketball and its previously untold Scottish connection. In this episode, we're going to discuss the life and influences of James Naismith, the inventor of basketball. I'd like to welcome Ross to the podcast. Hi, Ross.
Hi, Andrew. Thank you for having me.
By way of introduction to the topic, Ross, what made you first reckon there was a deeper Scottish story here that nobody was telling? Was it inspired from a conversation, or did you stumble across it in the archives looking for something else?
So it actually started probably when I was much younger. So I started playing basketball when I was maybe 8 or 9 years old. And I grew up in a very football dominated community. And don't get me wrong, I play football, love football. But growing up in this community, everyone had a very kind of derogatory vision and viewpoint of basketball and how it was. And I always remember, I can't remember where I read it or where I found it. It might have just been online somewhere. But I always remember my counter argument when I used to get kind of made fun of for playing basketball a little bit in a jokingly way. But I would always reflect and say, like, fun fact, did you know that basketball was actually Scottish? And it was something that no one ever took seriously, no one ever took forward. But I always thought there was something in it that I wanted to know. There was always an answer that I wanted to know more too. And it wasn't until the last few years where I kind of had a platform for myself where I've been able to do research and I've been able to have time to go and investigate these kind of areas. And I sat down to myself and I thought, you know what, I want to look at this a bit further. And I quickly started to do that and see that in a range of books and a range of different topics, like they mentioned Scotland, but again, even the historians, the academics, no one ever really developed it further. No one ever really took it seriously as if it was actually a significant impact on James. And I thought, well, I'm going to do that. That's going to be me. I'm going to investigate this and see why. And before I knew it, a small little investigation and inquiry, just wanting to find a little bit nugget of information for myself, turned into a 11,000 word academic piece that got published earlier this year. And very gratefully went around the world and is slowly changing the narrative of basketball being Scottish and James Naismith being Scottish.
The Naismiths left the west of Scotland in the 1830s during pretty desperate times, part of the massive Lanark Society emigration. Working class folk, millers and tradesmen seeking land and a better life abroad. What emerged from your research about how their particular Scottish roots helped shape the values of the places they went to and what they passed down to James?
Oh, good question. So the Scottish roots came to have a significant role in shaping people's values and creating cultures and most interestingly, even entire societies, because the places that they settled were just miniature versions of Scotland and which sought to maintain their Scottishness. The reason they would do that is because they never wanted to lose connection or become disconnected from their home. Many of the people who left, even the Naismiths included, they didn't actually want to leave Scotland. Most of them were very proud, they were very staunch Scots, but they were often pushed or forced to leave due to their own circumstances. The Naismith family were not farmers by trade, they were from urban Glasgow, but the opportunity for land was one they could not ignore. That chance to give their kids a better life and avoid starvation that they could not say no to. However, in transferring these Scottish aspects to their new homes, it was central to these Scots in these new parts of the world that they pass on this Scottish culture to the next generation, and that James Naismith's mother was the exact same. Upon her passing, she actually said that she wanted James, a quote for quote, to be raised a wee Scot. And I think that kind of speaks volumes for a lot of the how values were passed down and how they wanted their next of kin to be. But all the stereotypes and characteristics which make us Scottish, She wanted for James, to have the hard working nature of his family working class background in Glasgow and the resilience that they endured through multiple setbacks and that of even broader Scottish society. Throughout the 1800s, a lot of Scottish people had to really develop strong resilience to the changes that were going on from the Highland to the Lowland clearances that ultimately impacted the Naismiths as well. So James's personality and character was ultimately a byproduct of his family values, which were undoubtedly Scottish through and through.
Naismith was born in 1861 in Ontario, Canada, which means technically he wasn't Canadian in any legal sense at that point. Canada didn't exist yet as a nation. The whole identity question seems rather more complicated than we've been led to believe. Why does getting this political and historical context right actually matter for understanding who Naismith was?
Well, I think above all else, it tells you who he really was as a person and why basketball is the way it is today. And the Naismith family, in over the last few decades, have actually started to answer this question. And what they have this family saying, or what they say, is that to understand basketball, you have first got to understand James Naismith. And as I have found through my research, you can't understand James Naismith without understanding his Scottish identity. It's inherently who he was through and through. And by failing to do so, this is a real disservice to the person who created the game, but also to the millions and millions of people worldwide who love basketball and who it means everything to, because what we are at our root cause, we don't actually understand the game that we love. We've not been told the truth. And by understanding who Naismith was and his connections to Scotland, we're essentially understanding why basketball came to be and it's turned into this global phenomenon that it is today. But also what it allows us to do is revert back to consider what Naismith wanted for basketball with his first vision. So for the last 130 years or so, we have not been given the most accurate information about the history of basketball or James Naismith. And moving forward, what we need to do is put a greater emphasis on updating basketball's story. However, what is really interesting in my research is that I constantly found across books and websites that many people in basketball and academia talk about these Scottish roots, or they use terms to say that he was very proud of his Scottish heritage. I think after my article was picked up in America back in March, the Naismith Hall of Fame responded by using that exact quote, saying he was very proud of his Scottish heritage. But what I really dislike about that term and that little phrase is that the word heritage and roots almost indicates that Scottishness was distant to him, as if it's anecdotal. But actually, Naismith was directly Scottish through his parentage, through his daily life, through his culture, through his background, through his ethnicity, through his religion. He's not proud of his Scottish heritage, he is Scottish. And we need to start reframing that.
Naismith grew up in Almont, Ontario. Almont, practically a miniature version of Scotland, as you alluded to before. The local newspaper publishing Burns, annual Highland Games, everyone at the Kirk on Sundays. It's striking how thoroughly Scottish it all was. What was daily life actually like for a young James growing up in this transplanted Scottish world?
In contrast to any youth or person living in Scotland during the 1800s, Naismith's upbringing was really no different. In many ways, it was almost identical to living in a small Scottish rural town. Every day, the family would work on the land, and the kids would go off to school and learn all the same subjects as if they were in a Scottish school. Much of these subjects, again, were through a Scottish lens. Very interestingly, I found one class that during the time that James Naismith was at his local schools, a geography lesson which looked at parts of Scotland and the Highlands, and there he was in this small Scottish town. He would then come home from school and complete his chores on the land before going away and out to play with his friends. Most importantly, everything in this local community, as you kind of touched on, same as in Scotland during the 1800s, everything surrounded the church. The same as in Scotland, the church guided society, local culture with daily services, readings of from religious scripts like the Pilgrim's Progress. Naismith and his family were also really deeply involved in the choir and other activities. The family were actually so heavily involved that they used to sing and perform music to Scottish songs. His grandfather was actually on the committee for the choir and was involved in selecting these songs. And one thing that I found really interesting, and I still find incredible to imagine, was that I was reading this newspaper article from the Almonte Gazette, and I was starting to gather this picture of what the community looked like and what life was like in this town. And in the process, I found some of the songs that the choir were singing in their local services. And one that really stuck out was one called Bruce's Address to His Army, which is a famous song by Robert Burns. And what this song does is it evokes a strong sense of Scottish sentiment and patriotism. Because what it's referring to is how Robert the Bruce defeated the English army at the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314 during the Scottish War of Independence. Now, what is really fascinating by this is we still sing these Scotland songs today. This history still sustains our national identity. And there you go, 150 years ago was a small James Naismith standing in a church in Almont singing a song about how Scotland defeated England in open battle. And I think that is a real way that we can understand the people of this community and how patriotic they were, which that just kind of touches upon the depth of the Scottishness of this community because, as you said, there was the local newspaper which shaped everyone's outlook. Every day they wrote newspaper articles that talked about life back in Scotland. There was poems written in broad Scots. Many of these poems were written by locals and they talked about how much they wanted to return, how much they missed Scotland. You walked the streets and there was the Highland Games arena. There was curling played on local rinks. The clothing in shops was all brought over from Scotland and it was the Scottish trends. Everything was Scottish and all in this small town in rural North America where James Naismith could be found at home or out in the streets, reading the works of Robert Burns and other famous Scottish writers who ultimately came to shape his influence, thinking, outlook on life. The entire community is transparently Scottish, and what's actually really quite funny was that I was over in Canada back in May for work, and I was up in Ottawa, and I thought I'll take a day trip to Almont to visit and see what it was like, because there's the little James Naismith Museum. There's a famous little statue. So I went out one day to go visit, and I was walking around, and the town hasn't changed in 150 years. All the buildings are exactly the same. They've all got the dates above the doors from when they were built in the 1800s. The Highland Games arena is still there, absolutely massive facility. The other local sport is an ice arena, which they've now adapted to incorporate ice hockey, but before it was for curling and still is. Aside from that, you walk around and the Church of Scotland is still there. Very interestingly, I went into one cafe and I was sitting waiting for my taxi to come pick me up. I ordered a cup of tea and I was just sat down waiting. There was four older women who were sitting there having a coffee morning, and they were sitting talking, and one of them turned to me and asked me the very generic North American question of, "Are you Scottish?" Because they heard my accent when I was ordering at the till. And I said yes. And before I could even reply to tell me anything, the first thing that came out of all four of their mouths was that my grandparents moved here from Scotland. So that entire day that I walked around and I spoke to local people, everyone who heard my accent, heard that I was Scottish, straight away asked me the same thing. And they told me, every single person, which was double figure people, that their grandparents or great grandparents were Scottish and they moved here. And even today, the community is still the exact same. The people are still very proud to be Scottish. And everywhere you go, on walls, there's a big black watch logo. In this small town in North America, there's a black watch logo. Why is there a black watch logo there? But there is, because it's a Scottish community. And it's so small that there's only a few hundred people still there today. But they have a Highland Games arena, they have curling. We don't even have that in our own towns in Scotland. And this town is more Scottish than we are.
So this old children's game that James's dad John and Uncle Peter would have learned back home, Duck on the Rock, and then taught to James himself. You can trace direct lines from it to basketball's elevated basket and arcing shot. How, from your research, were you able to piece together this connection between a game straight out of the Scottish schoolyard and basketball's fundamental design?
So while completing my research, I cannot tell you how many newspaper articles, documents, books that I had to go through to develop this kind of image of every single aspect of James Naismith's life. However, I remember while I was in the process reading somewhere that Duck on the Rock was key to the creation of basketball, and that it stemmed from his childhood and his own work. And it's mentioned that his family introduced it to him, who must have learned it back in Scotland. And so with that being said, I started looking around away from basketball and Naismith to see if there was any kind of historical materials I could find which link Scotland to Duck on the Rock. And then in that process, I found a few, some which again highlighted how Scots had taken the game and introduced it to their new homes where they had settled during the diaspora. One very interesting one actually came from Boston during the late 1800s. However, it was really when reading the rules and picturing how it was played, the Duck on the Rock, which aside from being heavily dangerous, but the basic premise was that the line that they would stand on was about roughly where the free throw line was today, and there was a person standing about 15 feet away where the basket would be today. And behind this person was a large boulder, and on this boulder there was a smaller rock. And the objective was that 15 feet away, people would have to throw a rock over the top of this person's head and knock the smaller rock off the boulder. And that was the fundamental objective. But when I was sitting reading about this and I was trying to visualize how the game was played, if you close your eyes and you think about it, in order to get the shot to go over the person's head, it has to be thrown in an arched manner. It can't go through the person, it can't go under the person. And it was reflecting on that not only James used that in his design for basketball, but even if you think about it today, the game that was played Duck on the Rock is exactly the same as if you were trying to shoot a jump shot from the free throw line over a defender. And that's still in play today. That was still in play when it was first created. And it was still there when James Naismith was thinking of this concept.
James lost both of his parents at an early age and was then raised by a stern grandmother, Annie, and his uncle Peter. It's a really grim tale in places. You and your research argue these difficult years were extremely and importantly formative. What's your thinking on how these hardships shaped the man who'd eventually create basketball?
I mean, I think you've kind of touched on it there, that it's actually a really sad story. If you stop and reflect, it must have actually been a really terrible time for what was such a young child. All these people were so significant in his life, and then so suddenly he lost them all, most of them within a very small period of time. And he just had to continue forward in life and adapt, and that kind of really just shows his resilience. It's the fact that these kind of harsh measures, which really came to form and develop his character, personality, his outlook on life. His family say that much of his rationale for basketball not only came from Glasgow, but a lot of them they say actually came from his childhood experiences. Because of the roughness of his upbringing and the harshness of it all, he in later life wanted kids to be nurtured through basketball in the kind of wholesome and altruistic way that it's intended. Yeah, it was kind of through his uncle Peter that the life's harsh realities, through labour, religion, this was where he instilled Scottish Presbyterian integrity into his kind of mindset. Both families that came together, the Naismiths and the Youngs, they were very deeply religious. What they ultimately did was it succeeded in developing a very devout Presbyterian, whereby the lessons of the Lord were all ingrained in the mind of young Naismith, and that's a direct quote from his family. Overall, I think there were two defining moments in the upbringing of Naismith, which, under his very stern Scotch uncle, came to kind of form who he was. The first was whilst attempting to save the family sleigh and horses from drowning in the Mississippi River after ice collapse, where his uncle Peter, a fully grown adult, left Naismith, a young adolescent or child, to risk his own life to save the family goods, the family sleigh. Another was Peter often forced Naismith to walk to school in life-threatening conditions, which went up to minus 30-degree temperatures. Any problems in life, Naismith was generally left to resolve himself, as they believed that it would develop strong character. Peter believed these experiences really encouraged him to mature much quicker, and they taught Naismith soft skills and traits like initiative, self-resilience, ultimately contributing to this family ideal of Scotch family virtues, which would help him in later life develop his inventiveness that he later applied to creating basketball, because he had to think out of the box and on his feet to get around these scenarios from a very young age. Some would say that under Peter's strict tutelage, that Naismith became a strong, skilled, and well-developed person with these strong Scottish values and mindset. So, while these were all harsh, much of these traits later reflected in Naismith's behaviour, such as his willingness to persevere and establish basketball at a time when he was struggling to do so. Also, when he faced lots of opposition for his idea to merge religion and physical activity, which at the time went against the status quo and societal norms. All of these things must have taken a great deal of courage, and a lot of them are aspects which people really undersell in terms of the value of the creation of basketball and the struggle that he went through as a person to get to the point of creating this. And it's something that deserves a lot more credit and a lot more focus in terms of what he's done for the world today.
Dr. Peter McGregor ran the Almont High School along Scottish educational principles, that distinctive approach combining rigorous academics with physical development. Naismith struggled with languages, excelled at maths, even taught for a spell as would be normal at the time. How did this specifically Scottish approach to education set him up for what came later?
While the Scottish approach was implemented and stemmed from the connection to the range of Scots who kind of settled in the area and transferred their knowledge, but also because of the political connections at the time between Britain, Scotland, and North America, it was largely a region that was still under Anglo and Scottish influence because, as we discussed earlier, it wasn't its own independent country yet. What was really key was that Scotland at the time had one of the best and most developed education systems in the world, and this would then ultimately become very key for Naismith. It was through the Scots' focus and priority on education that Naismith became close with McGregor, who down the line would then become a key influence and mentor in his life. I imagine he came to be a key part of the process and reason why Naismith wanted to become an educator himself, because of the support and guidance that he received from various conversations with McGregor. It was a very small school, very few pupils, and because of that, Naismith was allowed a lot of one-to-one time, a lot of mentorship, so he was able to be guided by McGregor. Furthermore, it was through his educational background that he had been introduced to as a young age, whether through the school system or even the church. It would not have been possible for him to go to McGill University if he hadn't gone through these steps and these opportunities hadn't existed. He would also have never come up with the idea that he wanted to go, because it was through the education system and being introduced to it that this idea that going to university was possible. So now, while knowing that he wanted to be a minister in life, he would have needed to go on to undertake a degree in theology, which again, it is this culmination of these very Scottish factors coming together that put him on this pathway. It's not one dimensional, it's a whole range of factors. And the same way, like the education system was also very key, not through a one dimensional lens of just what it taught him, the lessons, but it really motivated James Naismith to stay on this positive track, because in between his education, Naismith took a break during his studies to become a lumberjack, which goes against this very idea that we have of James Naismith when we envisage this man. But it's true, at one point in his life, he was a lumberjack. There was a key day where during his time he was actually found in a bar to be drinking, and he was told by a person who knew his mother that if she could see him in his present state, that she would be very disappointed in who he had become and what he was doing with his life, and generally the fact that he was drinking, going against the family principles. But it was then after that experience that he decided to go back to education, and it was through that motivation of wanting to become a minister, the role that education could play in his life, building towards going to McGill, that it kept him on this positive pathway to an improved life. That had he not done so, again, he would never have gone to McGill. He wouldn't have led to the next step in his journey. He would have just been a lumberjack who never invented basketball.
As you mentioned, by the 1880s, Naismith had graduated from Almont High School and had headed to McGill University in Montreal. Montreal at the time was dominated by Scots. Half the city's leaders had Scottish origins. Naismith joined the Fifth Royal Scots and moved through the social networks that these institutions offered. How did these connections end up steering him step by step toward Springfield, Massachusetts?
The Scottishness of Montreal at the time had a real impact on Naismith, so much so that Naismith would actually at one point wanted to leave and return home because he was struggling to adapt to life and university there. However, it was this Scottish support system and network and the presence of the cultural components that he was used to growing up that kept him in university. So while he joined a Scottish regiment, and through this process he was able to partake in Scottish country dancing, and he talks, and his friends talk about in their own reflections about how they flaunted around McGill campus in downtown Montreal in their kilts. Montreal was key because while he was also always interested in sport, this is where sport became very important to him, because he came from a small ecosystem where sport was more recreational. one where he moved into a larger town where within society there was competitions, there was leagues that were more formally organized, and most importantly, there was a collegiate system for sport. So it was actually down to two key people that he decided to take up and start playing sport. And these two gentlemen were also, like James Naismith, were second generation Scots. One was a chap called Donald Dewar and another was Jim McFarland. What they did was they found that Naismith tended to stay in his dorm room quite a lot, and one day they approached him in his dorm and they very politely, although it wasn't polite, they convinced him to partake and go against kind of the societal norms of where religion and sport didn't go hand in hand. They weren't welcome to mix. A lot of ministers didn't really approve of people taking in this vigorous activity. Naismith, without having had this conversation of being told and encouraged to partake in sport, this is what led him to the idea of merging religion with sport. And it was through that process where then one day he was walking through campus and he decided to partake in an activity. And after that, that just started this whole journey into a range of sports where he soon excelled at athletics, boxing, football, gymnastics, lacrosse, rugby, association football. And then in time, he started winning medals and accolades like the Wickstead Medal for best sophomore senior athlete. He was playing what we call American football. He then went on to devise and create the first American football helmet. And this is a narrative about basketball, but again, this just shows his ability to develop products and sport and equipment. And it's here that in that environment that he starts to develop this idea that he can do these things to sport and he can have an impact. There was one very key moment where he was playing rugby and following a teammate on this rugby match who turned and swore in frustration. As soon as he stopped and recognized that he was in the presence of James Naismith, who was a senior student and a theology major at the time, this inspired a real sincere apology to Naismith because the person recognized that his behavior was unacceptable. And it was that moment that James Naismith had a penny drop kind of experience, and he realized that he could combine his ministerial training with sport to transform people's lives. And ultimately, that thesis or that ethos would then feed into his later ideas for basketball. Ultimately, it was while he was studying in Montreal that he met a man called Luther. Now, Luther was at the time from Springfield College, and it was there that he spoke with Naismith and informed him about Springfield and everything that they were doing. And if it had not been for James Naismith being in Montreal, having these connections, going through these processes in life, essentially being at the right place at the right time, then my question is then, does Naismith go on to invent basketball at Springfield in 1891? And it's without that key person, those three key questions, those key moments. Again, I don't think so.
In Springfield, Naismith was tasked with developing a new indoor game for the winter months, and when he was under pressure to come back with something, this is a fantastic quote, he specifically said that all the stubbornness of my Scotch ancestry was aroused. His own words. The Naismith family insists he created basketball as a Canadian Scot, not as an American, even as he took citizenship later in life. Why do you think this has been lost to history, and what specific Scottish elements can you actually identify in basketball's design and philosophy?
It is really unfortunate that this narrative has been lost to history because it ultimately explains why basketball is the way it is today. While it has changed massively and moved away from what Naismith wanted to be, which was not the kind of overly commercialized product that it is, he obviously wanted it to be a tool for good, tool to help people. At its very core, the foundational principle still linked to its Scottish influence. Sadly, I think this has been lost because in the early stages of basketball, where it came from and why it came to be were never a top priority for people at the time. It is only in the last kind of 50 years or so that historians have really started taking more and more of an interest, especially in kind of the last 20 years. I think it was in the 2000s that there was a mass auction which sold off all of Naismith's belongings, his scripts and his personal documents, and these have since spread everywhere to McGill University, to the University of Kansas, who have a large archive. It's only in this last 20 years where people have started to see value in this idea that memorabilia and heritage is of interest. There is this saying in history that we kind of talk about, and it's that history is written by the winners, And what that means is that our narratives and knowledge of the world are shaped by those in control and positions of power. And that is why we today worldwide kind of tend to fall victim to this notion that basketball is an American sport, that it was invented by a Canadian. And it has created this flywheel effect where a lot of incorrect facts or vague information have been spread about basketball. And we're now at this stage where the challenge is now trying to change that narrative which has existed for over 130 years and become accepted worldwide, almost seen as the gospel truth of basketball's story. Looking more deeply into it and embracing Scotland, it doesn't retract from what already exists. It actually adds to the story and brings the narrative more alive and gives it a richer, more meaningful and purposeful story that is really rooted in the person's trials, tribulations, heritage, which no other sport has. Basketball is the only sport that you know where the founder, the location, and the time all stem from. And we need to do more to kind of engage with that and bring that alive. In terms of the Scottish elements in the original design and philosophy, aside from the influence of Duck on the Rock in terms of the aspects of the playing style that we've already kind of mentioned, the game itself takes pieces from a range of different sports, and these are not just unique to Scotland. And I think that's important that we mention that this isn't solo Scotland in the narrative. Naismith was also said to take strands from lacrosse, for example, which hails from the Iroquois people, and a lot of other sports such as association and football and rugby. You know, these were all actively planned and played and connected to Scotland in some capacity. And you know, we've recently just found out that football is not English and it is confirmed that it is Scottish, and that's another benefit of heritage studies. Where Scottishness is really and clearly ingrained in basketball and is still there today is through the philosophy and rationale. Well, the sport was created to pacify rowdy students during the winter months. The onus underneath all of that and what drove Naismith before, during, and after its creation was that Naismith wanted basketball to be a mechanism to help people. He wanted it to be a tool for good in the world. And much of that linked to his religious beliefs in the Church of Scotland, which cemented this ideology in Naismith that what life was about was supporting people and communities. And basketball was exactly how James planned to support people and communities. That was his tool, that was his gift to the world. Now, 134 years on, and we still see that today, that philosophy, that rationale is still embedded in the sport, and it always will be. And we see it worldwide with millions of people whose lives have been positively changed. You and I are having this conversation because of that philosophy. That's why you and I, 130 odd years on, are here just now on a podcast for people to listen to. And it's all because of that design and that philosophy. And on top of that, the world, where it's the NBA, it's professional teams, it's countries, they're investing millions of pounds into sport programs which seek to invest to improve the life qualities of people worldwide through basketball. And that is the philosophy that he wanted, and that is all linked and traced back to Scotland.
Even decades later, moving from Springfield to Denver and then to serving at the University of Kansas for 4 decades, even after witnessing his creation at the 1936 Berlin Olympics, a moment he called his proudest, James Naismith kept making pilgrimages to Glasgow, maintained his Scottish accent, described Scotland as home. He never really let it go. What does this lifelong attachment reveal about his own self-image, identity, and its connection to everything he created?
I think, above all else, it really just emphasizes how Scottish James Naismith was. And I think one example, kind of linking to what you said there about his pilgrimages, was that above all others, and this really hit home for me, was the fact that after having completed his studies at Springfield and becoming part of the staff, he invented the game in 1891. And then about 18 months later, Naismith during that time had saved up all of his money, and he then eventually used his savings to come to Scotland to purchase his wedding attire, connect with family, and explore everything that he had learned and been told about during his childhood. He essentially came to the place that he had always wanted to go to. So while many people might be asking, why is that significant? Like, what's the meaning behind that? Well, if we put ourselves in the shoes and mindset of someone in the 1890s or James Naismith, this decision and process was not simple. James had to travel from a ship from Boston to Glasgow, which would have taken anywhere between 8 to 15 days. And you don't do that for no reason. You don't do that on a whim. So the fact as well that his wedding attire was not purchased in America or Canada, but we think of him as American and Canadian, this really resonates, I think, not just with James and his identity, but also our ethos as Scottish people today and over the last 150 years, where when you think of people getting married in Scotland, even people who don't consider themselves patriotically Scottish, they still revert when they're getting married to Scottish traditions. They still go for kilts. They still have some kind of tartan or music, kilts, bagpipes. James Naismith wanted that as well. I think that really speaks volumes about who he was, his mindset. But most importantly, I asked myself and others the same question: why did he save his money? And with his first kind of main trip, with his first full-time job, obviously he was a lumberjack earlier, but still, he'd been distant from that for a while. So why now? Why put all of his money aside to come to Scotland? Why not go to America? Why not get his wedding attire in Almont or Montreal, which were closer, they were cheaper, and they were connected to his upbringing? Why go to the place that he's never been? And I think not only did his family, friends, and kin kind of state this, but I think he saw himself as Scottish, and not just in an anecdotal sense where second, third, fourth generation Scots say that they're Scottish. I think James truly believed that he was Scottish because all his actions and behaviours, they speak volumes about this, especially as you said, almost 50 years on from leaving his home in Almont and through no force or pressure or influence from family, he's away from them now. He's living in Kentucky, which doesn't even have a huge Scottish community, but you still found him in his older age enacting elements of Scottishness in daily life, where he restarted and wanted to continue a choir which he was grew up in as a child. He still read Burns, he still spoke with Scottish verse, where I think in one of his various scripts he would send his partner love letters and he would write it in Scottish dialects. All of this just links back to Scotland and it shows how much it truly meant to him.
Your research is careful to note basketball emerged from multiple influences. It's a complicated global picture. Where in your mind does the Scottish dimension fit into this broader, messier picture of how basketball actually came to be?
So I think we've touched on this a little bit throughout. Based on the research that I've done and all the reading through all the various documents, personally, I would say that the Scottish influence is at the forefront because while this seems so simple to say, but it is undoubtedly true that the Scottishness of Naismith and his family put him on a pathway that ultimately led to the creation of basketball, which without this pathway, I ask everyone the question, does basketball exist? Because without the Scottish Presbyterian background, James Naismith doesn't want to become a lumberjack. He doesn't want to do anything else. He wants to go on to be a minister because of the impact on his life. Without the family's decision to emigrate and leave Glasgow and go to a place that was underdeveloped, that instilled the skills and characteristics and the ingenuity and the innovation skills that Naismith needed to improve games of the future. Without the key people directing him through, whether it was McGregor, whether it was his academic lecturers, all these other people, he does not go to Springfield. He pursues a different life. His purpose in life is not to create basketball. That's not what his mission would have been. And then all these other influences that we talk about, where people say we need to acknowledge that his influence and education as a physical educator, and also the modern ethos of the YMCA that gave him a platform because it merged sport and religion. But all of these things are redundant if James Naismith doesn't have the steps before that take him to that place again, to be at the right place at the right time. And I think after it all, you have to ask yourself the question of, because a lot of what I've seen and have read in this American-centric that we're faced with, It's other people deciding who he is and who he was. It's other people telling him that he's American, that he's Canadian. And I think after all of this, we're talking about a person who was alive and created this game over 130 years ago. And the people that we need to ask are not ourselves. We need to ask one, James Naismith himself, two, the family, the Naismith family, and then after that we can consider his friends, his associates, his kins who knew him. And at the core of all of that, all of them identify as being Scottish. So after all of that, our opinion today is completely irrelevant. Whether people want to say that he was American, that's great. But he took American citizenship decades after he invented basketball. So you can't reclaim him 40 years before. Similarly, Canada didn't become a sovereign nation until after he passed away. It's not legally possible for him to be Canadian. And so after all of that, even the legalities of it all, it doesn't matter. James Naismith identified himself as being Scottish. His parents wanted him to be Scottish. He was Scottish through his parentage. Where he was born meant that he was a British subject. It meant he was not Canadian. So after all of that, Scotland is at the forefront and is the foundations for the development and creation of basketball.
Ross, thank you very much for your time. That was amazing.
Thank you, Andrew. I appreciate you having me on.